Okay. Test, test. Okay. I'll turn it back on.
Are you speaking? No. Ken? Right.
So not this one.
Oh, actually, well, I was thinking this one for the
No
question.
problem.
Check, check, hello, hello, check, hello. Don't want there to be too much feedback.
Okay, so we're ready to begin. Welcome back, everybody. Happy New Year. New year, new time, new beginnings. And Ken Goldberg is here to initiate a whole stream of incredible people coming this year. More than usual, actually. Ken is an artist, an engineer, a kind of a hybrid artist-engineer, which is what we like. He's also a professor of robotics at UC Berkeley, and he's exhibited at the Whitney Biennale, Venice Biennale, Pompidou Center, the Walker Art Center, Ars Electronicas at KM, ICC Biennale, Gwangju Biennale in Seoul, Artist Space and Kitchen in New York, and he's also held visiting positions at San Francisco Art Institute and the MIT Media Lab, the Pasadena Art Center. He's a really active persona in the media arts field. And we met at SIGGRAPH in 1992 or 3 at the Machine Culture Show. I remember Ken having his hand stuck in some furry device. And I came out and he said, come here, go touch it. And I just put my hand in this furry device and there's something going on. And of course it's connected to the networks. And this is 93, right? So I was just absolutely thrilled. And we've crossed paths many, many times at different shows. And it's really great to have him here. He's incredibly active at UC Berkeley and in the UC system in connecting the so-called disparate fields of arts and science, and is the founding director of UC Berkeley's Art, Technology, and Culture Colloquium. Now in its 9th year, he holds a PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon and has published over 100 research papers. So he's not someone who's given up engineering in order to pursue arts, or is pursuing arts halfway. In fact, he's also quite active in a social awareness raising venue. And that's what he's talking about tonight. The title of his talk is Too Close for Comfort, Free Speech, Privacy, and the Demonstrate Project, which of course happened at UC Berkeley. And he has a treat for us tonight. He is going to show a movie that was just accepted at the Sundance Theater. That's quite different from the talk that he'll present, which will just represent how eclectic Ken Goldberg is. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that. It's a very sweet introduction. I want to say I remember. I want to say that I remember the 1993 show, and Victoria has not aged one day since then. I want to talk about something tonight that is related to a new project that we did on campus, but I think it also relates to some of the concerns that have been discussed here in relation to the biology and art show and symposium last year that really addressed a number of ethical issues, because I think they come up in a different context in this project. So what I'd like to do in about 45 minutes is talk a little bit, give you a little bit of background of my work and what led me in this direction, and then talk about the Demonstrate project, which is the specific installation that raised a number of these questions about privacy and surveillance. And then I would like, as Victoria mentioned, given that we have some time, we'll take some questions and then do the film. And I also we're going to try an experiment where if you have a question, if you're online, or if you're here and you're on some wireless connection, you can email it to Victoria, and she's graciously agreed to field questions and then ask them during the talk. So the general topic here is privacy, and I like to think of it in some senses as related to, analogous to oxygen. In other words, that it's something that's invisible. It's very hard to think about. It's abstract. And it's something that we don't often think about until, in some way, until it's threatened or taken away. Now, this is a project that, now I'm giving a little background. This is the project that Victoria mentioned. It was a project where we were interested in a device. We built two of these devices, a pair of them. There's a plexiglass cylinder that you place your hand in and has a switch inside there, just a simple binary switch, and then two solenoids on either side. And then this is connected, these solenoids are also binary. They're connected out over a modem to another similar apparatus at the other end. And the idea was very simple here, that when someone squeezes the switch, the person at the other end feels the solenoids activate, and vice versa. And in that way, two people could hold hands over the phone. Now, when we started experimenting with this, we had failed to properly ground the solenoids. And so that every time it was activated during testing, large arcs, electrical arcs would emerge. So as Victoria mentioned, this created, that became ultimately much more interesting to us than the original idea. And we ended up calling this data dentata. And a few years after that, the internet came out, and like everyone else, it took me by surprise. And it was very interesting. I was very inspired by the idea of the web camera. The first webcam was about 1993, and when I saw that, I was working with robots, and I thought, well, if we can take, in other words, not just images and text over the internet, but we can also take live. We can capture something live about the physical world. Why couldn't we take that another step further and actually manipulate the physical world? So some students and I started this project, sort of an evening background project, and we put together what's now credited as the first robot on the internet. And it got a lot of attention, and so then this was actually the second project we did that was called the Telegarden. And this is meant somewhat ironically, the idea of, we thought about the most absurd application that we could come up with. I should mention Joey Santaramana, who's also from the LA area, was a collaborator on this. And we built an 18-inch a planter with 18 inches of soil, and inside the robot we put hydraulics, and we had a camera inside. So people over the internet could move the robot around to visit the garden, if you will. And then they could control it, so they could observe. They could also water the garden. But then after they had spent some time in the garden, approximately made 50 moves, they were then granted a single seed. And they could decide where they wanted to place the seed in the garden. And as you can see, the hydraulics would move around and It would plant the seed and water it, and of course nothing would happen. So the idea was that you had to come back and spend time. And we were very interested in one sense in the contrast between the sort of instant gratification of the internet and in the the idea of biological reality, which doesn't change very quickly. And that's for me been an ongoing theme. I'm very interested in this idea of the contrast between biology, our physical reality, and technology. Another project from around the same time was using networks to connect to the physical world, but in this sense it was the Earth's minute movements. And what we worked with the Berkeley Seismological Laboratory, and we connected a live seismograph to over the internet to a sound installation, and the data is then sonified, and this was done by Randall Packer, a composer, who so that the effect when you're in this environment is that you're getting a sound immersive sound experience that's live. In other words, it's the Earth is always moving, and so the sound is generated on the fly. And we found that this is about a 20 by 20 by 20 foot enclosure. People would come in and experience it as you see on the ground, which sort of gives you a full body experience. There's subwoofers. It's a 5.1 channel system, and interestingly, it's completely unpredictable. And usually on a day when you have some important curator or writer coming in to visit, the Earth is very quiet and not much is happening. And then as soon as they leave, the Earth immediately starts responding again, and you get much more it's much more dramatic. But like trying to get a pet to do tricks on demand, the Earth doesn't always cooperate. Anyway, this project has traveled around, and we are now working with the San Francisco Ballet on taking a version of this and using it for a performance. And then this project was something that was trying to get at the issues of credibility and maybe exuberant, irrational exuberance. This was something called Ouija 2000, and it was a project we did around for the Whitney Biennial that was right at the turn of the century, and it was when the internet was still at its just at its apex, and there was a lot of arrogance, and you'll all remember those days, and we wanted to critique that to some degree, and we're also thinking about the origins of the Ouija board, which came out around the turn of the 19th century. And was interesting because it was also a time when there was major developments in communications. So at that time it was the telegraph and the telephone were emerging. But if you can put yourself back in that perspective, at that time it wasn't so far-fetched that you had these new technologies that let you talk to distant and unseen persons. So it wasn't so far-fetched that maybe there was a technology that would let you talk to the dead. So we wanted to play with that, and so we built a robotic Ouija board. And this was the interface, so that anyone over the internet could come in, and they were instructed to put their mouse in front of their computer screen. And then we monitored minute mouse motions. So as your mouse moved, we would sample that, send that back to a central server at Berkeley, and then we would average all the motions from all the players that were online simultaneously, and then use that to drive a robot that would move a planchette, and then that would be sent back to everyone through video. And it's kind of not meant very because of the time delays and the distances. It's not intended literally as a Ouija board. But interestingly, this project was online for a number of years and still attracts a lot of attention, especially around Halloween. Probably gets an average of about 20 or 25 people a day. So it continues to amaze me of all the projects that the Ouija board still has an incredible, compelling aspect for in the online world. Now, I was interested in this idea of of credibility that really grew out of a lot of these projects where we were doing experiments with robots and installations with robots, and several people would ask, or through email, how do we know that there is a robot? So for example, in the garden, the question is, maybe you just faked it. You took some pictures of a garden, you set up this interface, when I click on it, it seems to be doing things, but how do I know there really is a garden? And that really became an interesting question for me. I'm still trying to, I'm still thinking about it. And this, what I call this a distinction between virtual reality, where you have a synthetic environment, which is clearly fictional, that seems lifelike and realistic on the computer, versus telereality, that it's rather than fictional, it's real, but it's distant. And I'm particularly interested in the gray area, the cases that are on the borderline between these two, that are not so clear which of the two you're dealing with. And there's many examples today. When you see images of, for example, scientists moving atoms, and James will correct me if I'm wrong, but those images are synthetic. And we look at them and we say these are atoms being moved, and we're looking at atoms, but these are in fact synthetic images that are generated by graphics. So we can talk more about it during questions, but this led to a book that I edited for MIT Press, and I brought together six philosophers, 6 artists, and 6 engineers to write essays looking at this issue, what we call telepistemology, from a variety of perspectives. And shortly after that project, I became interested in the same questions, but applying them into a more social environment. And in a sense, all of these participants were interacting not only with the physical world, but also with each other through the robot, or through the garden, if you will, or through the Ouija board. So there was a kind of social dimension. But on this side, it was just a robot or a game board. So the idea is, we thought, let's try and make this a more interesting dynamic environment. And so we replaced the robot with a human, and we called this the teleactor. And so this person is equipped with a wireless network connection back to a server, but also video cameras, microphones, and displays, so that people online can see what she sees and, in some sense, control what she does. So this raised a whole other set of questions about the sort of questions of participation, willingness, and will on the part of both the teleactor, who was not, and we purposely wanted to make a distinction between robot, which comes from the root really comes from slave, and an actor, which especially down here in Los Angeles, you all know, this is someone who has a certain amount of free will. And the idea of a teleactor was someone who would essentially take direction from people online, but was not obligated to do exactly what they were told. But there was also a dynamic of the participants in the social environment, because they were approached and they were now immediately visible to this group online. So we tried this in a number of different contexts. This was the Webby Awards, and we had the teleactor come on stage, and she has the cameras in this. This was in the Opera House, so the camera's buried in a set of opera glasses, and there's a wireless transmitter. And Sam Donaldson was the MC that night, and I had 1 minute to explain to him what we were going to do. And so I said, okay, well, she's going to come on stage, and she's wired up through the network, and what we're doing is we're getting instructions from people out there, and they're coming in through her earpiece, and then she's going to respond to that. And he said, wait a minute, that's what I do. So they had a very nice sort of dynamic between the two of them, and ended up hugging at the end, and it was a nice moment for teleaction for the project. We also took it out to a variety of we took to the Exploratorium and to some art openings and installations, and people were surprisingly receptive. It may say something about the social environment where people give a fair amount of latitude at an art opening, but in this particular version, we did a performance where the teleactor was to go out and ask people to give a personal object. And we started with asking for keys. So we walk up to people as they entered the gallery and say, may I have your keys? And surprisingly, they were very happy to hand them over. And then they were deposited back behind, in a room behind, in the back of the gallery where the display was. And the idea was to sort of create a circulation, but also to create a certain sense of vulnerability. But what was interesting was, so we had I was worried that nobody was going to give their keys. But interestingly, people just handed them right over without even hesitating. But I probably shouldn't have been so surprised because it was kind of like valet parking in some sense. So then we started upping the ante and we said, give us your credit card. And people still gave us a credit card. By the end of the night, we were getting bras, panties. I mean, it was there seemed to be no end in sight. So we also were thinking about the teleactor as a technology for education, for distance education. And this is a whole other talk, which I won't give tonight. But we explored a number of areas of essentially having a scoring mechanism to essentially turn the interaction into something of a game. And I can say more about that as well. Okay, so this leads us to cameras. Now the model you see is similar in these projects where we have a number of users online connected to a server and then a device that they're sharing control of. And so we had the robot, we had the teleactor, and this became interesting to us because a new generation of robotic cameras have emerged since 9/11. And these are very powerful cameras that have that are robotic. In other words, they can be directed to servo, to pan, tilt, and zoom to a desired area. And this became interesting from the computer science side because we were able to formulate it as a computational question. Here was the problem. You have a number of people out, let's say, over the internet, and they're all sharing control of the camera. So what you see at the bottom is a panoramic image of the full camera workspace, everywhere the camera can look. And we generate that by moving the camera around and then stitching all the images together. So this is a shot in my lab, but this is the panoramic view. Now we want to be able to let people online control the camera. And the interface we came up with was very simple. You could just go in with your mouse and drag a window to say, I want to look at this. So we felt that was pretty intuitive. And then the challenge is we have lots of people coming in simultaneously, and they all want to control the camera at the same time. By the way, I should mention that these issues of contention of many people wanting to take control simultaneously have run throughout these projects. In this case, however, we were able to mathematically formalize it as follows. We said, okay, if you take all these frames, the question is, where should you place the camera? In other words, can we formally define an optimal frame? And the naive thing to do is you just simply do an average. And that can be very bad. For example, you can have lots of people want to see over here and lots over here, and the average would bring you over there, which is not ideal. So what we defined as the frame selection problem was that you're given these n requests, these are the frames, find the optimal frame. And the step of this is to formalize it is to define a satisfaction metric. And so just bear with me for 2 slides. I'm going to give you there's a little bit of math here, but it's actually fairly intuitive. The idea is that if you have this frame the question is if the person wanted the yellow frame and you give them this black frame or this white frame, the person and they're completely disjoint, there's no intersection between them, then the idea is that there's zero satisfaction. You're not happy at all. And here, if the 2 frames are identical, you gave them exactly what he or she wanted, then you have the satisfaction being 1. So and those boundary conditions seem rational. We want to have some satisfaction metric that works between those 2 extremes. And it turns out that there's a variety of satisfaction metrics out there from pattern recognition and other, and from database theory. But we found one, we actually modified one that had some very nice properties. And it's related to intersection over union, but something we call intersection over maximum. And it gives rise to this kind of objective function. So the idea is that if you move the camera frame around, you're not happy at all here. The satisfaction is 0 here, but it gets very high. Your satisfaction is pinned at 1 when you're inside the desired or the requested frame. So this is the objective function for a single user. And then what we can do is define a global satisfaction by summing the functions for a number of users. So the result is that if I have, in this case, just 2 users, I add their satisfaction functions together, I get this surface, and then I want to find peaks in the surface. And the nice thing about this function is it's piecewise linear along axis parallel lines, so we can develop efficient algorithms for finding the optimum. And so this was the PhD work of my student Des Song, who developed a whole series of algorithms, both for the discrete case, where there's a discrete number of zoom levels for the camera, and also for the continuous case, where the camera can be zoomed arbitrarily. So I'm giving you this as background because this is the context of where we were in the lab in about 2003. The other thing that was going on, of course, and I mentioned the 9/11, is that the world was changing, and not just in the context of technology. There was the events in the Patriot Act and the concerns of Americans and our government were such that there was a lot of shifts, not so subtle, in the way we were treating civil liberties. And so we became interested in this context, specifically how technologies like cameras were being used and applied. And of course, there's a long history here of concerns about imaging and surveillance that go back to both in the audio realm and the visible realm. And this had, in a sense, risen to a new level with the Patriot Act. And I think simultaneously with that was the developments that were happening with technologies like the internet and cell phones and cameras. And for example, now it's increasingly common that cameras are present on almost all freeways. I believe it's probably true. I know it's true in the Bay Area. I'm sure it's true here. But cameras are put out there for ostensibly monitoring traffic conditions, etc. So the Department of Transportation puts out these cameras. But what is not as widely known is that when there's an accident, the cameras are often consulted and used for evidence by the insurance companies to find out exactly what happened. So they do have a very interesting potential here that we are being watched as we move around. And of course, last spring, or last fall, Google came out with their new satellite-based Google Maps, which is a wonderful tool if you want to find directions, but also has some interesting consequences. This is my home. This is the house where I grew up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which I was a bit surprised that they would find my small town location there. But sure enough, it's there. And so one of the things that, and this is not live, of course, but is important to keep in mind is that this is a trend, that we're getting more, these things are getting more, the resolution is increasing. And if you've played with Google Earth, it's really quite dramatic, the effect. The other thing that's been going on is CCTV, and this is the program in Europe that has really taken off since 9/11, but has been initiated in response to the IRA bombings, and so it was embraced by citizens of London, and now it's expanded dramatically. So the reports are, I still find this hard to believe, but the reports are that there's 4 million of these closed-circuit cameras installed around the UK. And this is a typical, way that this is advertised, is that this is here for your benefit. And it does seem to have effects on crime. Interestingly, it lowers crime in the areas in the vicinity immediately around the cameras, but it tends to move the crime to neighboring areas. So then those neighboring areas often demand cameras, and it's sort of, you have this, this progressive effect. And the idea of these cameras are not, one thing I think is important to realize is that these cameras are not always being controlled by some sort of lone individual peeping Tom, but they're also, we're bringing these cameras into our own lives voluntarily. That we are, the cell phone with camera became ubiquitous last year, and what I think the important change is that the resolution, the quality of these cameras is going to increase dramatically in the next year or two. We're going to have 10 megapixel cameras, and as you'll see in a minute, the consequence of that is dramatic. I also want to just mention some of the other work that's out there, because there's a very nice body of work on surveillance and art. This is an early work. Vito Acconci did a piece about the following piece, where he basically followed people who came. He basically just decided to pick at random a person and then followed them around Rome, and he would follow them all day long until they ducked into what he considered a private place, and then he couldn't go any further. So this was all documented, but it was an interesting case of playing with the idea of private and public spaces. I put this up here because this is an example of a public artwork, and it relates to our Demonstrate project in some sense, because it raised a lot of controversies, and it was particularly because of its nature as in a sense, an artwork by Richard Serra that had raised a number of aesthetic issues, but also was felt as problematic in a public environment. So there's a lot of nuances about putting an artwork. It's one thing to put an artwork, in other words, in a gallery setting, but as soon as that gallery setting starts to open up and it becomes part of a public space, the conditions change. Now, Julia Scher, who's teaching here this term, is also another artist who's worked with issues of surveillance. She began her career installing surveillance systems. And there's the surveillance camera players out of New York who basically take a performance approach to addressing cameras. They basically do impromptu performances in front of surveillance cameras. Steve Mann, who's doing some very interesting things, where he basically instruments himself. In a way, actually, in some sense, there's a relationship with the teleactor, but in his case, there's no one controlling him. He is using the cameras to record his physical environment, and what he calls surveillance, which is rather than surveillance, he wants to look back up and monitor the surveillance apparatus around him. Michael Neymark, who's now at USC, took the strategy of using these laser pointers and developed an approach to disabling cameras by beaming a laser pointer at them. If you can do it long enough, you can burn them out. And Maurice Sester also used, this is different, it's not a camera, but she used a spotlight, a robotically controlled spotlight. And so as individuals move, they're tracked and followed by this spotlight, which has a number of references. And again, this is interesting because it's in a gallery setting, not in a public environment. Although Rafael Lozano Perez developed a system that involves spotlights pointing at people in a public space. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but there's a number of other artists who work in this area, and an excellent reference is Control Space, a book based on a show that was at ZKM, and it listed a number of different artists and writings around the subject. Okay, so this brings us to our project, which we initiated last year, and we were invited by the Whitney to do something for their online gallery, the Artport, And the slot that was available was fall of 2004. And interestingly, that coincided with the 40th anniversary of the free speech movement at Berkeley. So I was very interested in this, this history. I'm assuming everyone knows about this, but 1964, and at least I often thought it had to do with the Vietnam War, but it actually predates concerns about Vietnam. It was actually about the freedom of speech related to the 1964 presidential election. And students were, there was a Republican governor, and it was the Nixon Goldwater campaign and election, and students were basically signing up students to protest on campus. And the word came down from the Republican leadership that the governor should put a stop to this, that that's not what they should be doing on campus. So they actually banned students from recruiting on campus, and said that you couldn't do it during this. This is the Sproul Plaza at the heart of Berkeley. And students rebelled, and they held a sit-in, and they basically shut down campus for a few days. And at one point, a police car arrested one student, and the students surrounded the police car and basically held it for several days. That's Mario Savio, who died, unfortunately, in '95. But he led this revolution that was extremely important and really set the stage for the student rebellions in the '60s. So this was the date of this this picture was October 1st, 1964, and interestingly, so we were approaching October 2004. So I wanted to do something that would commemorate in some way and raise some issues that were, I felt, still relevant. So we took the camera that we've been working with, and we got permission to install it over Sproul Plaza. And this is the panoramic image that's generated. The difference is this camera is a much higher powered camera. This just came out. It had come out just the few months before the installation, and so it could reach. It could look all the way down Telegraph over to Sather Gate, and then over to Zellerbach Theater. So it has a very broad range of view. And so here it is mounted on the building. It's about 5 stories up, so it's pretty high, and it's fairly small. It's about this big. Just one camera. But it's a small dome in there, and so it's sitting on the roof. And so this is just a typical image. In fact, the images you saw as you were coming in were images that were collected from the camera. And then I want to give you a sense of the zoom power. This is the camera pulled back, the widest field of view. And then this is approximately the field of view at the median zoom level. And then this is the field of view of the maximum zoom level. So if you go into the medium, you get something like this, but at the max, you get that. So you can clearly see the title of a book that someone's holding. You can almost see what they're reading over their shoulder. And I should mention that this camera, I mean, we were very alarmed when we first discovered this camera. By the way, the price of it is $1,200, and it comes with a network server built in. So you can just plug it in, and it's accessible. It's what? Axis camera, yeah. The Axis is another version. But what's interesting is there's now a 40x optical zoom camera, and they've lowered the lux ratings on it. So these are getting more powerful, and they're adding audio. So we put this online, and our intention was through the title to reflect that it was related to the demonstrations of the 60s, but also to demonstrate literally the technology. And so this was the website where you could come in over the net. Anyone could come in, and this was the interface. So what you had to do to get access to this was you had to register. And for us, you give a very little bit of information, but your email address is key. And then we send you back a password. that you can then use to come in. And I've done that in almost every project I've developed, because in some way I feel it sets a level of engagement or accountability for users, or participants, I like to call them, well, we can talk more about that if you have questions. But once you registered, you come back and you get into this page. Now this is a Java applet that lets you, as you can see, the bottom interface is very similar to what I showed earlier. Users can come in and drag windows on their own screen to say that they wanted to see, say, something over here. And up here was a live camera image, the video sequence. You could also do fine motions, and you could zoom in. But again, zooming was easy by just making a smaller camera frame would indicate it, that you wanted to zoom. What's important here is that it listed everybody who was actively logged in, all the participants here. We could talk more about this, but there was a scoring factor, but I don't have time to go into detail. And the key thing, though, was this button here, which was capture image. Because not only were people able to come in from anywhere in the world and operate the camera, but they could also record a snapshot. This is just gives you a sense of the responsiveness of the camera. It's about 4 to 6 frames a second, depending on your connection speed. But as you can see, you get a pretty vivid image of what's going on. And this was the database. In other words, once you captured an image, your photos were placed in the database, and people could go in and look at them. We also encouraged people to make comments on other people's images to create some dialogue or some interaction between the participants. And one of the ways we did that was to try and make the connection to the free speech movement. Was we took Mario Savio's famous speech that he gave address when he was on the police car, and we took pieces of that speech, and we used those as triggers. Within each of the photographs. So each week, one of these phrases was inserted at the beginning of the photograph. So that the idea was that our intention was that people would go in with one of these phrases in mind and use that to find photographs that were in some way related, and then complete this initial phrase with their own captions. So this was, for example, a response to outside pressures was the theme of that week, and then these are some of the captions that people put. And again, you could take your own images, but you could also respond to other people's images. And so the system went live on September 1st, 2004, and began to be operated. We got it was announced on the Whitney site, on the Rhizome net list. So it started to get some traffic, and as you can see, the camera is able to zoom in and observe pretty high levels of detail, and also at night. And this was interesting. The camera was available 24 hours a day. One thing that surprised us was that there was a great deal of activity at night, and this was taken about midnight. And a group would always form here almost every night without fail in the center of Sproul Plaza for these drumming circles. And I had no idea this would go on. But it was very regular, same group of people, and there was a lot of so the whole plaza had a different complexion at night. It had a different, there was a whole different usage of the space. And then this was another example where I don't know, dancers or something out there. People, sometimes you'd see, kids just sitting out drinking or various kinds of activities. We just captured all kinds of things that were going on in this public plaza. And then one day, about a week after it launched, I got a message to show up at the Chancellor's office at 4:30 the following day. So I frankly was a little surprised, but I didn't know really what it was about. And as I got in the waiting room, there was, I looked and I saw the head of the legal affairs, the head of public affairs, head of academic senate, representative from the law school, the chancellor and the vice chancellor. There was a big meeting to talk about this project. And in some sense, we shouldn't have been surprised. I wanted to create some reaction, but I didn't quite expect how much of an issue it would become. Now, it was, I think rightfully, the concern that was expressed was that this project, the first question was it legal, what we were doing? And I had done some homework, which was I had contacted a person, a legal scholar who was out of Pittsburgh, and asked him, and his opinion was absolutely it's not a problem. But a law professor from California said that under California laws might be different, and that we hadn't adequately investigated the California law. So my answer was, I'm not sure. So then there was some concern that the next question was whether I had gone to the Human Subjects Board. And that was really a loaded issue, because if this was deemed research, then it would be a gross violation to do this without going to the... I had not, by the way. Then you could actually basically be fired for doing something without their permission. But my contention is that this was not research, this was an art installation, and covered by, ironically, free speech protections. There was an interesting dialogue. I mean, I basically argued that it was a slippery slope if every art project had to go before the Human Subjects Board. And fortunately, there was a lively discussion in the Chancellor's office, and the end conclusion was that that our main concern was the ultimately legality. That the Chancellor said this is an important issue. In his mind, this is a free speech issue of our time. In his words, and then he basically asked me to reduce the zoom level somewhat until they could study the legal issues, and I agreed. And that really, and then I began a process with the professor of the law school, Deirdre Mulligan, who it turned out was active in the Clinton White House on civil liberties issues, and an expert in technology and the law. So we reduced the zoom level. The project stayed up for another 6 weeks. In fact, actually, we got permission to increase it again to maximum during the one day when there was a big campus rally for the free speech movement, and Howard Dean came to campus, and we let the camera go in full tilt during this big rally. And we also agreed to monitor the system very closely. And I'll be happy to talk with you because I think there's a lot of issues here. Not that I don't have time to talk about them all. But one other thing that came out of it was that the joke is that at a campus when you have a problem, form a committee. We created this committee on vision and privacy. And one of the things that became apparent was we started looking around on the internet and said, well, what is the policy on cameras? And it turned out that there really wasn't any policy at Berkeley, at least. I should mention that there was a camera on Sproul Plaza for about 5 years, just a general webcam, low resolution, and nobody had a problem with it. And I'm sure there's one at UCLA. There's just many cameras out there. But at some level, this thing had become, the zoom level of this had become too close for comfort. It had crossed a line. And I was really interested in where is that line, and in some way should that be quantified or should there be some accountability? So this group met a number of times, and in particular, I went to meet with the security, the campus security, the police department, and they had some guidelines, but it was interesting because they were deliberately vague about where they had cameras on campus. And it was interesting because I was asking, well, where do you put what are your guidelines? And they got very uncomfortable. They said that they have a lot of cameras inside buildings, which doesn't seem to be a problem. But outside buildings was a problem. And the question is, well, what about if a student wants to put up a camera outside their dorm room? I mean, is that okay or not? So we started to develop a a policy, and we looked at, there were 3 areas where cameras were, there were issues of cameras or applications. One obviously was security, and the other was this human subjects area. And then the other was all these other kinds of applications. Journalism famously has an exemption from human subjects. In fact, if you've dealt with journalists, you know that they often use trickery to get the story. And certainly, I think art, public relations, putting cameras up for, to promote the campus seems to be okay. But I think, art is an interesting category that hadn't been, still has not been carefully addressed. So we're still working on this. One of the things that we have proposed is that there be a registry, that at least there's a place where cameras should be registered, and somewhere on the web, so that you can go and you can see where the cameras are. If you see a camera, you don't know who's running it, you can find it on the web. And in some way, there's again, it's an issue of accountability. But then there's a whole question about permission and how that would be granted. Interestingly, the police department did not want to take responsibility for that. They just didn't have the manpower to review all the potential cameras that were out there. So the issue of responsibility is still to be resolved. What should be covered by these cameras? I mean, clearly we don't want to have a policy that handles all handheld little digital cameras or cell phone cameras, etc. But where do we want to draw the line? And then there's the question, several people made an important distinction between cameras that are used by security, where there's security only viewed by the security personnel. That seems to be a different category than cameras that are in some way visible by the public. And just to give you one example of where this becomes particularly problematic is, that was raised, was that some student comes from Saudi Arabia, comes to campus, decides to become a little bit more liberated, has a boyfriend, they're out holding hands or kissing on Sproul Plaza, and someone captures this with the robotic camera and then sends that back to their parents, which creates a huge, could be potentially lethal consequences. The question is, what happens when these cameras when this information is out there over the internet? There's also issues of dummy cameras, which is very interesting. I had always thought it was okay to put dummy cameras up as a deterrent. Turns out, no. There's a California case here where someone had put a camera in a garage for this kind of purpose, a dummy camera, and then there had been an attack, an assault in the garage, and the victim then went back and said, "Where's the tape?" And the owner of the garage said, "Well, we don't have a tape, it's just a dummy camera." And she successfully sued the garage for giving a false sense of security. And so there is, then that case is widely known and widely cited, so that you very rarely see dummy cameras placed in public. And then there's this issue of notification. For example, in our project, one of the issues that that came up in this meeting at the Chancellor's office, and we anticipated and spent a lot of time talking to the students about, was how do we let people know about the project? I mean, that was our goal, was to tell everybody about it. So we put up flyers and posters, and we actually set up a booth on the Sproul Plaza to tell people about it. But the question is, you really can't, if it's in a public space, it can't cover everyone. So that was the story of the project. It was also shown at a ZKM and then at the Cantor Center. And if you Google demonstrate, you can go to the site where now we have archived the 1,100 images that were taken. And we're developing, there'll be a symposium next year in November on this subject, and we're bringing in speakers from around the country on the subset of what we call visual privacy. So that's to distinguish from audio privacy or just data privacy. And looking at this from a variety of perspectives. I should say that one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is that I think there's a very sort of standard initial reaction of cameras like this or surveillance that is that's very negative and condemnatory. But as I've been thinking about it, I wonder if there's not some aspect in which these cameras are in a similar position to, say, television in the early 60s. In other words, television was considered this kind of oppressive, institutional piece of technology that was, basically controlled by these elites. But then with the Portapak, television became available into the hands of artists, and as we all know, the result is video art and all of the creative applications of it. I think there's something, and I'll throw this out just to provoke you, but I think that there's some aspect to which surveillance could be used as an art form. And I'm not just saying about these kind of, in a sense, protesting the camera, which I personally think is somewhat, is interestingly, I think it's going to have limited effect, because I think these cameras are going to start appearing more and more. But I think that also that I'm curious, what can cameras be used to show us ultimately, if they're in the hands of of artists and the public? In other words, what can we see about ourselves or public spaces, for example, that we couldn't see before? And I'll talk more about this if you have questions. But one of the things we found, interestingly, in this project was that there was that there wasn't really that much happening in Sproul Plaza. We expected presidential election, lots of big protests and rallies, etc. There really weren't that many. And so there was a kind of banality that resulted. And we just got glimpses. I mean, the snapshots, if you look through them, they're just everyday activity. There's just a sort of mixture of things that are not that extraordinary. And I think that says something to some degree about what our perception or expectations are of these spaces and what the reality is. And I was also interested in the idea that what was selected was images that were also taken by this sort of another form of the public. You had a public out there in the space, and then you had a public on the internet taking pictures of the public. So it was sort of a self-portrait in some sense of a public to a public. And the question is, well, what did they look at? What did they frame? And I think there's something to be said about that as well, about what they looked at, which was the different kinds of images that were taken. Okay. So I do want to say that this was a collaborative project that involved a number of different contributors, especially on the algorithm side. And I'll be happy if you have any questions.
As far as privacy goes?
Hi. As far as privacy goes, how far can an artist go in invading privacy?
In invading privacy? Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I mean, I think, we
like Vito, walking around following people.
Yeah.
So, because you brought up this, what are artists going to do with these things?
Yeah, and I don't have a good answer. I can't say, you can go up to 14 times, 14x optical zoom, and that's it. I think it's a complex question, and I also think that there's a responsibility if you're going to take a risk, and this relates, I think, for example, to the biological art and biology and genetics, which is also pushing envelopes, but you have to be extremely careful about what these tools and these mediums that you're going to work with. But I do think it's worth pushing the envelope.
Hi, Ken. Just, we have many grad students here, and so there was one of your earlier projects, actually, which you didn't mention, that also was pretty provocative and actually raised strong reactions, which was, of course, legal tender.
Yeah. And
I would be actually happy if you could just, with a few words, explain that for the grad students. And I would also be sort of like curious, just hearing, so first of all, how you feel about that project right now. That was also highly political and actually piece that really sort of like explores the limits which is permitted in society.
Well, thanks for asking for that. That is a good precedent, actually. I think I might have, yeah, a couple slides on that. Yeah, and that project was, to some degree, it was also a networked art installation, to some degree inspired by Milgram's experiments, obedience experiments. And what we did there was we took, this was about 1997, so the new $100 bills were just coming out. And so we used those as a context, and we had a website where you would go in and there were two $200 bills shown, and it was explained that one was real and one was counterfeit. And your objective was to determine which was which. And so you, again, if you wanted to be involved in the experiment, you would register, get a password, and then you were randomly assigned one sector of one of the bills, A or B. And then you were offered the opportunity to choose one of these experiments that you could perform on the bill. So these were the different ones. You could just zoom in on the bill, or you could puncture, or you could burn a hole in the bill. And interestingly, overwhelmingly, something like 95% chose the thermal test to burn the bill. And then once you did that, we put up a reminder about the consequence of that there was a federal statute about mutilating bank currency, and since we had your web address, we would then ask if you would wish to proceed. And it was this moment we were trying to build up to, which was that moment of hesitation, because it was a real consequence in some way. Habeas corpus. You could actually go to jail in some sense by pressing this button. Interestingly, again, we had statistics on this project. Almost everybody said yes. So the project was interesting in it was also very complex, because right around that same time, J.S. Boggs, the artist who draws money, the currency, was arrested and was tremendously harassed, and I think he had a nervous breakdown because of the Treasury Department pursuing him. And we became really nervous about this. After this whole project was conceived and was on exhibit, I was coming up for tenure, and it was like the worst possible time for me. So it was a very nerve-wracking period. And yeah, I mean, any artists who work with money, if you want to talk about a real lightning rod, is a big problem. So I warn you, be careful if you're going to do a project with money. This one really pushed the envelope, and we were lucky in a sense that we didn't get called on the carpet for this one.
It seems like the laws
Have gotten lax?
Relaxed, yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, well, it seems like you can represent, you can now take pictures of money. You couldn't do that in the past.
Interesting. There's a whole other interesting thing about they're trying to develop patterns that are going to be on money that will block copiers from taking pictures, or cameras. And the chip in your camera will detect the pattern and then won't let you take a picture. So now they're saying that this is a way of actually achieving privacy. So you would have a t-shirt or a button with the pattern, and you wear it outside, and basically someone goes to take your picture and it won't let them. So there's something interesting about possibly using technology as a way of achieving some sort of privacy.
Have you ever done it?
I'll come back. Erky, I didn't want to.
So can I just ask another question that actually goes back to the demonstrate? So I haven't checked the website. So you talked about this aspect of these texts matching those shots online with those texts, right?
Yeah.
I'm just curious about this. You also mentioned Rafa Lozano-Hemmer's pieces, and vectorial elevation,
Yes.
which is probably most famous piece. So, which I think our students also know. So, the controlling the robotic searchlights on Zocalo Square from the internet, and one of the interesting aspects of that piece that hasn't been talked so much is the fact that in addition to basically choreographing something over the Zocalo Square and then basically creating a sort of like website, actually it created automatically a web page of that.
Yeah.
So you had the option actually of adding a textual message. And now I think Rafa was sort of like curious about this textual side. So what kind of sort of like textual message would people actually attach to that kind of design they created for this, both the public space in physical space and then the virtual space of the internet? And now many of these comments were really flat and banal and stupid, I would say.
Yeah.
So sort of like really sort of like disappointing. Now, Rafa tried to say, well, this was part of the thing, you can do this and that, but I'm sure that he was disappointed as well. I was terribly disappointed about the flatness. That was around the 2000. Now I'm just sort of like a little bit curious about this, now you take a topic like the free speech movement, and there's this irony that you mentioned. There's almost nothing happening on that square except these banal everyday things. How about this textual layer that was attached to those images? Does it have anything more radical, anything more socially conscious, anything like that?
So a great question, because I think this is a challenge to artists anyone doing an art project like this is an interactive work is you want to stimulate kind of interesting interactions. And when you're just out online, people can be very boring, and they just want to check it out and they'll say cool. That's a typical response. Well, one of the things we did was, and I didn't spend much time talking about it, but there was a score for each participant, and what that score was explained when you logged in, which is you got points based on how many people commented on your images, or on after you made an image, after you made a caption, and other people made comments, responses to your caption. So there was an economy, if you will, that wanted you to make interesting images and interesting captions. So that's how we did that. And the score would actually weight so that you have more control over the camera if you had a higher score. So, and you put a score on a system, people really respond, we found. It's very interesting. It doesn't really matter that much what the score is, but if there's something to be compared, to compete with. So that led to more interesting comments than would have happened otherwise, I think. But I want to say that these comments were not, they were not boring, but there were some very problematic comments. Particularly there was a sort of sexist use of the camera that was offensive at certain times. Certain, basically adolescent type behavior, but it was zooming in on women at close range. And there was, this was about the second week or so in, we had reduced the camera, actually before we had reduced the camera, the first week, there were some of these images, and it was very problematic because there was like 2 or 3 guys, not from campus, who were using the camera to really zoom in closely and saying things like, commenting on the women that were there, and saying, at one point there was a line that said, "That's what this camera is for." And so it was really a problem because it really started to take it off in a very negative direction. So I emailed, and I thought hard about this and talked with all the students involved, but I ended up emailing the three culprits there and asking them to desist. And I took a risk because I signed the email and everything, but I said, listen, it's not what the camera's for, and could you cool it? And interestingly, all 3 emailed back saying yes, and they backed off immediately. But that was an issue. And so if you look through the documents, you'll see that we actually even suppressed a couple of the images because they were offensive. And that raises another layer of free speech questions. Some have said, you put this camera out there, how can you now, censor these images that we took? So yeah. Or the comments, right? There was a couple comments we had to remove as well.
I'll ask. It's probably an answer is no, but have you ever done anything with the lists of your participants who give you email addresses?
No, we're very careful about that. Actually, that I take very seriously. We never sell them, give them out, do anything with them. Even, actually, the one thing we wrestled over the most was to use a list to notify past members from another project about a new project that was coming up. And we did that a little bit, and then we decided we didn't feel comfortable, so we stopped using it. So yeah, we've been